Hello. Thank you for having me back. It's nice to be here. It's nice to have Edmonton and I hear maybe Calgary with us. I spent a few years in the Edmonton young single adult wards and had a good experience there and met my wife there, so it's close to our hearts. So as a bit of background for this, these are, if I can get this to operate, there we go. So these are based in part on the church's gospel topics essays. And you can find them, I went just the other day to the website, so this is pretty much what it looks like. So you go and you can see that gospel doctrine. Sorry, President, this isn't, I'm not getting my, let's try that. There we go, okay. You can see there the gospel library, it's under the first to the left, the first menu to the left. It will give you this, and if you look down here, there's this thing that says topics, and then you come here, and there's a thing that says gospel topics, that's where the essays are. And then you'll get a big long list of things here that says gospel topics, and if you scroll down the side, you can find plural marriage in the church, and then you'll get this article to the right. The church articles used to have footnotes in them. I'm not sure why this one doesn't all of a sudden. I hope it's an oversight. I hope they're going to put them back because I was actually wasn't as good or something. But anyway, you scroll down here in that article and you'll come to this little bit down here. And that's where you click if you want to kind of see some general stuff on the material we're going to cover tonight, though tonight we'll do more detail than that, I think. So let me preface this. We're going to do a few of these on plural marriage if that's what President Wild decides we want to do. So background information, and let me preface this too by saying if you have questions or if I wish we were all here and we could answer them when they come up. If anybody watching has questions, I hope you'll email them or text them to President Wild, or hope I'm not out of line saying your stake president in Edmonton or Calgary or wherever you're at. And if they can get those to me and then we can talk about them. Or if there's other topics like this that you think would be useful to cover, that would be helpful to know. So why is plural marriage? Why does it trouble people, or why does it give them difficulty, or why might it threaten their testimony or concern them? Well, part of it is that it finished over 100 years ago. 150 to 150 years ago is kind of the span when it happened. And so it's deep in the past. That doesn't seem like or sound like that long ago, but culturally it's an eon. It's a long time. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were probably closer culturally to the Middle Ages than they were to us. There's some real differences there. And if you don't know much about the past, then plural marriage will be even more difficult to understand. Second, it was difficult for the people then. If you think Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and the rest were keen on this, you haven't read the evidence. They were not keen. It took a lot of them a great deal to accept it. And there's some really extraordinary stories about both leaders of the church and just kind of your garden variety members of the church that nobody's heard of, talking about the revelations they got on this subject. Some of them before they even knew that it was something that was being taught. The history is also complex. There's very few areas of church history that are more difficult. One of the researchers in this, Brian Hales, he's probably done the best work and the most recent work on it. He likes to say that 98% of our evidence is late. It's after the fact. Only 2% of it comes from the time in which it happened. And that's a difficult position to be in. There was also certain secrecy around it, especially at the beginning, because they were afraid of the mob. And so a lot of things that we would like to know, we don't know. And we don't know nearly as much as we'd like to about the things we know about. Because of that, it's very easy for critics to tell you only part of the story. And that part of the story they tell you will be true enough. They'll probably include some true facts, but it's very easy to just take you a certain distance and then just kind of drop you off. And as the critics will say, did you know that Joseph Smith was married to women, plural marriage, who had more than one husband? That's a true statement. But if they just leave you there, that's not a very good place to get left. I'm going to hopefully try to bring you a bit further on in that topic as we talk about this. Our case has not been helped by the fact that some church members have given explanations about these things that are either incomplete or completely inaccurate. And that hasn't been done out of any malice, I don't think. It's just something they heard from someone who heard, and, So it doesn't help if something that you heard said about this wasn't true. It can make people feel betrayed, or as if they haven't been told the whole story, and that's some kind of dark, nefarious plot. Well, it's not a plot, it's just we all teach each other, and if you don't know, then it's hard to teach me. Number 6. Now we're getting into even the more sensitive stuff, I think. We realize, at least I hope we realize, that combining religion and sex is dangerous. Usually combining sex with anything is dangerous. And so it's very easy to wonder if Joseph Smith or his other followers had evil motives for what they were doing. If that doesn't occur to you, then you're being very naive, I think. I mean, if you put true prophets that were asked to practice plural marriage on one hand, and if you put religious charlatans who used religion to exploit their followers so they could have more sex, I think you would probably find more of the latter. Whether Joseph Smith is an exception to that, you will have to decide. But let's be very frank and honest at the outset and say that, this is a potentially dangerous area, and we should pay attention. And that brings me to the last one. And I think at its root, this is the thing that really gets people. This is why people have a very emotional, if you like, reaction to this, an almost revulsion to it. And that's something I understand and can sympathize with. It's not just the history that gets us, it's that the history stirs things up. It reminds us, especially if we're women, I think, it reminds us of times when priesthood leaders put us down, or when we were mistreated by men or boys in the church, or when we were abused, or all those sorts of things. And this subject just strikes so closely to home that it's almost like kind of touching a stove. There's this reflex to withdraw. And of course, that's a perfectly legitimate way to feel and to react. If you think you might be in that category, or even if you don't, you might try to step back a bit and analyze your own reaction. And if you're in that, then I would say that's understandable, but if you really want to understand this period of history, you have to a little bit set that aside and kind of go through the motions here as we look at the evidence. So question number 1, did Joseph teach and practice plural marriage? Yes, he did. He was married to approximately 30 to 31 wives in his lifetime, and he had taught the principle to people in Nauvoo, 200 to 300 by the time of his death, out of about 10 to 15,000 in Nauvoo. So not a lot of people knew about it, but many did. Question number 2, did Joseph force women to marry him? No, he didn't. One of the things that Joseph would often do is he would, rather than first approaching the woman, he would approach a male relative and teach them the doctrine of plural marriage. Now, if you're looking to seduce someone in the 19th century, among really deeply religious conservative people, I guarantee you that going to their father or their older brother first and asking them and trying to convince them that this would be a good idea is not your best tactic. One brother said to Joseph, if I ever find out that you're going to debauch, that is, morally corrupt my sister, I'll kill you. And Joseph said, basically, yeah, I know, but don't worry, you won't ever know that, because that's not what I'm doing. So at this period of time, it was a very honor-bound society, and men took that very seriously, that it was their job to defend their family's honor. And it was even, in some circles, if a man caught his wife in bed with another man, it was considered justifiable homicide to charge. So Joseph did a lot of things that don't make sense if this is just all about sex. There are women who Joseph taught the principle to who refused him and continued in the church. One was Sarah Kimball, who said, Joseph taught me the principle of plural marriage. I asked him to teach it to someone else. And she said, and Joseph kind of looked at me severely and said, who would you have me teach it to? I've been commanded to teach it to you. But she stayed in the church. Her husband was not a member of the church. Hiram Kimball was his name. They both went west with the saints. She later became president of the Relief Society. So, there's many women who there was no force here. This wasn't you have to do this or you're out. Question number 3. This is the one I alluded to earlier. Did Joseph marry women who were already? See why the numbers aren't exact. There's no good evidence, as you will see tonight, I think, that any of these marriages were consummated. That is, there were not sexual relations in these marriages. What we think they were for is that they were intended as a way to seal families together. This was at the beginning of the church's understanding of sealing doctrine. And one of the things that the way it kind of seemed to work is that you would seal as many people as you could, and then you would seal somebody to one of the prophets, to Joseph Smith or to Brigham Young or to Heber C. Kimball or one of these. The idea being that you had to be tied in to someone who is going to heaven, and Joseph and Brigham were going, so that was a sure way to kind of end things off. Nowadays, we don't see it that way. We accept that there's going to be a long time in the millennium to work these things out, and that it's not a panic to get those things done. But early on, that seems to be how they looked at it. Interestingly, we know that at least some of the husbands, we don't know about all of them, but at least some of them, we know that they knew about it, and they gave their consent. And so again, if you're trying to seduce someone, picking a married woman and then going You'll see, I think, that no wife or the other husband ever complained about this. And they were typically families to whom Joseph was very close. There was usually deep links of friendship here. But this is one of the things, this is, in my experience, probably one of the top 2 things that bothers people about plural marriage. The second one is the age of the wives, and we'll talk about that next time. But tonight I want to look at this. So, the term that is used in the research is called polyandry. Poly means many in Greek. Andros means man. So polyandry is where you have one woman married to more than one man. It's a bit of an unfortunate label because it doesn't really match other polyandrous societies, but we're stuck with it. So when you read about polyandry, that's what it means. So I've got here a little... Let's see if I can get this to work now. This is a little timeline. One of Joseph's plural wives, Mary Elizabeth Rawlins Lightner, lived well into the late 1800s, and she discussed or often talked about plural marriage and what Joseph had taught her. And she described 3 angelic visits. There was one in 1834. We know there was another one here. And then there was a second one somewhere in between. I've put it here as kind of a hypothesis, and you'll see why I've done that. But nobody knows when that second one was. But I think I'll show you why I think that's a plausible reconstruction. Okay, let's see if we can get rid of those now. Oh, look at that. Okay, we're going to focus on this area. So the first plural marriage was way back in, there's debate, 1832 to 1835. I think a later date probably makes sense. And it particularly makes sense if Joseph did have this angelic visit in 1834, it would make sense that it was after that he practiced plural marriage. So excluding that one, we're going to look here. So here's the timeline from early 1841 till 1843, a year before Joseph's death. Here's all the wives that we have known marriage dates from, and those are they're set up sequentially on the timeline so you can see. Okay, that all the names and everything aren't necessarily important. It's just to give you a sense of it. There's also a bunch more that we have a range of marriage dates. We don't know the precise marriage date, but we know it wasn't before X and it wasn't after Y. So that's what those bars represent. So if you took these bars and brought it up, this blue one, for example, at the bottom, that means that she was married to Joseph somewhere in that range. Okay? Then there's a few that we know very, very little about. We know that they probably were married, but that's all we know. So they're over here. So now we're going to look, here you see, I've added this little thing there. So there's that third angel visit. When Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner said that the angel came to Joseph the third time to ask him or to tell him or command him to practice plural marriage. And he came with a drawn sword, basically telling Joseph that if Joseph didn't follow through on that command, that the angel would slay him. So I'm now going to circle on this graph all the women who were married when they married Joseph. Okay, so there's one here, and now watch the purple circles as they pop up. Okay, there's one there who we don't really know about. There's one there, etc. Okay. That was to one of Joseph's dead brother's wives. So let's just go back here. Now, what I hope you'll notice, or what we paid attention, is that a lot of these are clustered right here, right around this third angel visit. And a lot more are over here in the category that we don't know. So they could very well have been here, but we don't know. Okay, but most of them clump right around that third visit. You'll see why I think that's important in a bit. So this area, those areas. Okay. All right, so we have these marriages. Well, what were these marriages like? That's always been the historical question. Were they the same as other plural marriages, where people, had sex together and conceived children and all that, or were they different in some way? Well, I'm going to show you how this has evolved. And the reason I'm going to do that is it's a very good example of how history works and about how you should approach solving something in church history that bothers you. So this is the key marriage, or it was until very recently. Someone named Sylvia Sessions Leon. And this is something that her daughter said. Her bedside and told me that her days on earth were about numbered. And before she passed away from mortality, she desired to tell me something which she had kept as an entire secret from me and from others, but which she now desired to communicate to me. She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith. She, having been sealed to the prophet at the time that her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. And this daughter's name was Josephine. Josephine, you don't have to be a crack sleuth to see the potential connection here, right? So this has always been treated as the smoking gun of plural marriage that says, look, here you have a woman telling her daughter, who's named after Joseph, that she was his daughter. What more do you want? And when I was giving this presentation, or things like it, 15 years ago, that's what I would have told you. As you're going to see, the story gets more interesting. So what she told her daughter was that she was sealed to Joseph, or married to him, however you want to think about it, while her husband was excommunicated. During the period her husband was excommunicated. Okay? But there is, however, an affidavit. This is an affidavit she swore. They were trying to collect evidence about plural marriage. And you'll see that area with the green arrow. It says she was married in 1842 to Joseph. Well, 1842 is before her husband was excommunicated. So the conclusion that people then drew was, well, she was married to Joseph and she conceived a child with him while she was still cohabitating with Mr. Lyon. That feels kind of strange, or it bothered people. Okay, so she became the smoking gun because we seemed so sure that that's how it was for her. Then people said, well, if that's how that one was, why would you think any of the others are any different? Which isn't a great argument, but it's got a certain plausibility to it. So she became the paradigm for interpreting all these polyandrous marriages. This is one author, Todd Compton. He wrote a book on plural marriage in the early 90s, I think. And he said, Sylvia may have been revising history to explain to her daughter why she married Smith when she was already married to Windsor Lyon. That's a polite historian's way of saying, yeah, she was ashamed of it, so she lied about the date. Okay? And then he extended this analysis to all the marriages. He says, there is no good evidence that Joseph Smith did not have sexual relations with any wife, previously single or polyandrous. Well, what would good evidence of not having sex look like? But anyway, you can see how this was used. And remember, this all goes back to this affidavit that Sylvia signed saying she was sealed to Joseph in 1842. However, what Compton didn't know, and what nobody knew until, I forget the date, 2008, is that there's a second affidavit. It's a copy, it's the same one, but look at the difference right here, 1843. So if that date is true, then Sylvia doesn't have to be altering her story. Then she was sealed to Joseph while her husband was out of the church. She doesn't have to be lying, everything fits. Well, should we believe this affidavit or the other one? Well, they're the same. Both of them were written up. Neither of them ended up being signed by her. So it's not like she picked one and said, this is the right one. So that's all we have. The evidence, there's no way to pick between the two, except to go by her statement. If you consider her statement credible, then you'd probably pick this date. So what that tells you, though, immediately, is that anything that anybody writes about poly either doesn't know the evidence or is trying to deceive you. Okay? Because this changed everything. It changed how we saw this relationship potentially. And there's more. This is a diagram by Brian Hales, one of these plural marriage researchers. It's a timeline of the life. So if she got sealed in 1842, then this is where the marriage would have occurred, okay, right before her husband was excommunicated. Here's Josephine being born. Okay. If, on the other hand, I hope okay, there we go. So the and voila. We've already talked about that. One argument for the 1842 date instead of 1843 is that Sylvia was at other plural marriage sealings, and so that suggests that she already knew about it and was engaged in it. Well, that's possible, but there were other people who were at sealings at that time who weren't plurally married, male and female. So you didn't have to be plurally married to be at somebody else's plural marriage. So that's not a particularly compelling argument. So in my experience, the decision that you make here, which way you decide to go, depends far more on what you believe or want to believe about Joseph Smith than it does on the evidence, because the evidence simply can't tell you. You have to make a choice, or you can just shrug your shoulders and say, we don't know. So this is a good example of how you can have historical data, and I can come to one conclusion in very good conscience, and you might be able to come to another one in very good conscience. That's how history is. It's messy. We don't have a lot of details. There's stuff we want to know that we don't know, that we can't know, given what evidence we have. So, but let's entertain for the minute that Sylvia isn't the smoking gun anymore. Maybe it isn't the way it's been described. Well, if that's true, remember, she was the paradigm. We didn't have any other evidence on these other marriages, but they were kind of assumed by association or by analogy to be the equivalents. But if Sylvia's smoking gun is gone, then all that has to go out the window too. You have to completely revise or rethink how you're going to approach these other marriages. Talked about what no good evidence would look like. It's hard to prove a negative. But despite saying this, even this author decides that there were some marriages that were unconsummated. So he clearly thinks there's good evidence that they weren't. So it doesn't really make sense. However, later research did find some direct evidence that there were some women for whom this was in fact the case. Here we go. This is a lady named Ruth Sayers. She was married in her youth to Mr. Edward Sayers, a thoroughly practical horticulturist and florist. And though he was not a member of the church, yet he willingly joined his fortune with her, and they reached Nauvoo together sometime in the year 1841. So Mrs. Sayers is a member of the church. Her husband is a friend of the church, but doesn't join. And it says, while there was the strongest affection who sprang up between the prophet Joseph and Mr. Sayers, the latter, that is Mr. Sayers, not attaching much importance to the theory of a future life, insisted that his wife Ruth should be sealed to the prophet for eternity, as he himself should only claim her in this life. She was accordingly then sealed to the prophet in Emma Smith's present, and thus were numbered among the prophet's plural wives. She, however, though she continued to live with Mr. Sayers, remained with her husband until his death. So here we now have a different paradigm. Here we have actual evidence of a woman whose husband was not a member of the church, who was sealed to Joseph for eternity, but not for time. So there was no cohabitation here. She continued to live with her husband. And the reason that this was done was to seal families together. I particularly like this bit of evidence because this was my theory before we had this bit of evidence. So it's always nice when you have a theory and then you find new evidence and it confirms it. That sometimes tells you you're on the right track, or maybe you're lucky. And that thing that I just showed you there, is also out of date if they don't mention that. But in 2016, the plot gets even thicker. This is from the Deseret News, and this is the Mormon History Associating meeting, and it says Joseph Smith apparently was not Josephine Lyon's father, sorry. And by apparently, we mean 99.9% sure she's not. This was done by Hugo Perigo. We heard from him last time when we talked about DNA in the Book of Mormon. Hugo had done he's a PhD in genetics from Italy, and he had been collecting DNA from Joseph's descendants. And he finally got enough samples that he could figure out whether Joseph and Josephine were related by blood. And it turns out they are not. And so that rules out her as a daughter. So notice how much this has changed. Like I told you, 10, 15 years ago, I would have told you, yeah, Josephine, she's almost certainly Joseph's daughter. And now we have DNA evidence that says she is not Joseph's daughter. Signed, sealed, delivered. And what that does, interestingly, is it rules out all but one potential child from Joseph's marriages, except to Emma. There's only one other one, and it's pretty shaky. It's an early death in childbirth. So now where are we? Not childbirth, in infancy. So there are two options. So what did Josephine's mother mean when she told her daughter that she was the daughter? I guess there's three options. One is the mother could have been crazy or delirious or demented, but I don't think that's the case. So leaving that aside, either there was no sexual relationship and her daughter, she meant daughter in a sealing sense, or in the second, you could say Josephine doesn't know who the father is. She was having sex with two men at once. But she seems pretty certain about what she tells her daughter. So that's interesting. It's not entirely clear what's going on there. I favor the first explanation, but you could pick the second if you wanted. This is a list of all the children that various people have suggested were Joseph's children. So here's the name of the child right up there. Here's the mother that supposedly had the child. Over here, these are a bunch of different historians. These are historians who've written over time about this. The first one is Fawn Brody's No Man, No My History. Then there's Dan L. Bachman's thesis. Here's Compton, that guy I was talking about. Here's Hales, that other guy I was talking about. So if you look down, you can see whether they thought that they were children or not. Yes, no, or they don't say. The zero with the slashes, they don't mention it. So these are color-coded. All the red ones are either impossible or very, very unlikely. So as you see here, these are all impossible. DNA has ruled this one out. The DNA rules this out, and the timeline doesn't work. The DNA. If you look at the historical record, it really doesn't track. And, a lot of these, look here. Here's Sylvia Sessions, that one we were just talking about. See, everybody thought for sure she was the daughter, but she's not. Okay. Here's some more. So again, the red is ones that don't work. Blue are ones that are theoretically possible or have been mentioned, but that nobody buys. If you look here, see, they either didn't mention them or they say no. So none of these here are really, they're there for completeness sake, but they're really not on the radar. They're not live options. Here's one, again, who would have had to be conceived before they got to Nauvoo. It's kind of hard to conceive a child with someone when you're not in the same city, etc. So there's only one that's left. That's the green one. That's this baby who died in infancy. So maybe not, but we're never going to know because you can't get DNA from a baby that's deceased that doesn't have any descendants. Okay, moving on. So where are we now? So we've seen that the supposed smoking gun for, this is always, these relationships were sexual, isn't secure. There are other options, and I would argue those options are actually better reads of the data that we have. We have an explicit expression of a reason for plural marriage that doesn't involve sexuality, but that does involve sealing for eternity, joining them together. And DNA has ruled out children in all the testable cases, and things we thought were certain aren't anymore. There's also things worth thinking about that I call the dog that didn't bark. This is from a Sherlock Holmes stories. One of the detectives says, "Is there any other point that you would like to draw my attention, to which you'd like to draw my attention?" And Sherlock Holmes says, "To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime." And the detective said, "The dog did nothing in the nighttime." And Holmes says, "That was the curious incident." So a dog that doesn't bark is evidence that you would expect to see if something is true, but isn't there. In the story, the dog was known to bark at strangers. And so the reason the dog didn't bark is that the murderer, the guilty person, was someone that the dog knew. So that's how Holmes deduced who it was. He said, well, if the dog didn't know the person, the dog should have barked, because that's what it always did. But it didn't. Therefore, it knew its master was there. So what dogs don't bark with polyandry? Well, number one, no one ever complained about these sealings. And Emma never caused trouble about them. Emma did not like plural marriage, by and large. She gave permission for a few sealings, but she was never reconciled to it. But she never gave any trouble about these. That should tell us something, I think. Also, like we discussed, men were not shy about defending their wives, their daughters, and so no husband got angry, threatened Joseph, and in fact, many of them remained his very close, dear friends. That is not the typical reaction of someone who your wife cheats on with. So here's a bunch of the husbands. We'll just look at them close. Here's this Mr. Sawyers, who you've heard about, who was very close to Joseph, not a member, and was an eternity sealing. Here's the same thing, a Mr. Leitner. He was trying to get him to be baptized, but Mr. Leitner wouldn't. But he remained a loyal friend to the church, and he died in Utah. So again, this is not somebody who hates Joseph, hates the saints, is resentful. Here's another one, Sarah Cleveland. Her husband never joined the church, but was a close friend. She was very close to the family, though. While Joseph was in Liberty Jail, Emma and her children stayed in their house. And following Joseph's release, he stayed there with his wife and kids when they were reunited for 3 weeks. So again, these are people to whom Joseph is very close. It would make sense that he would want to be connected to them and they to him. This is more on Sarah Cleveland. Here's one. He was a faithful member of the church. He initially wasn't very happy about it, but he felt better about it and eventually stood in for Joseph and was sealed. So when the Nauvoo temple was ready, Joseph had already been killed, and all those sealings had to be done by proxy, and this husband stood in at Joseph's place for the sealing. This one, husband was a faithful member. We don't really know what he thought of it, but he later became a plural practitioner of plural marriage. Nancy Johnson Hyde. Hyde validated it, and Mirinda later chose to be sealed to Orson for time and eternity instead of to Joseph. So again, there was no hostility here. Same thing. Whoops, sorry. Here's somebody, this guy was a pallbearer at Joseph's funeral, and he later stood proxy for his wife to be sealed. We already did that one. I don't know why it's there twice. Sorry. Here's one whose husband was a faithful member, but he later apostatized. She was 6 months pregnant by him when she was sealed to Joseph, and they continued to cohabitate. And then this last one, I don't think this one was a wife, but it's the same sort of situation. The husband stood proxy for Joseph in the Nauvoo temple sealing. It's thought that she was probably sealed to him after death, but not in death. But she's still a possibility, and I've included her in all the data here. What other dogs don't bark? So none of those husbands get mad. If anything, they're supportive. A lot of them are non-members, and yet they're still, they're not hostile, angry. They don't do tell-all books. And that suggests something else was probably going on. We've seen that they stood as proxy sealers. And then this one is important too. There were no later attempts by Brigham Young or anybody else to either imitate these, to justify them, or excuse them. They didn't see them as models. They didn't feel like it was something weird they had to justify. There was one case, and this is my favorite church history story of all time. Funny church history story, not spiritual. So this is the only time we know of this happening. It wasn't a common thing. It's the single example, but it always gets mentioned, and it's in his private parts. And he had become a eunuch, as they say. So they went to Brigham Young and said, Brigham, we want kids. What can we do? And Brigham gave them probably some of the strangest advice they'd ever heard, which said they would call on some good brother to help me that we might have increase. So the couple eventually accepted, but they went away saying, no way, no how. But they each later saw a vision on their own and said, wow, that really is what we're supposed to do. So they went back to Brigham Young and they said, okay, the Lord's convinced us, And so Brigham gives them a paper with 3 men on it that he says, any 3 of these guys I would consider worthy to participate. So that must have been an interesting conversation, picking the man who's going to conceive your child. So they pick somebody, and they go tell him, and is he thrilled and excited to have sex with this woman? No, he is not. He at first refused, but he also later became convinced that the plan was divinely inspired. One of the children that was conceived in this way, I'll give you a spoiler that it worked out. One child said later, it took 3 visions and a religion to reconcile others to my coming. So the infertile couple had been sealed in April 1857. They were divorced, and then the donor husband married the wife in 58. The first husband did not cohabitate. He lived away. They were divorced for all intents and purposes. They were then divorced. The donor husband, if you want to call him that was divorced, and they were resealed 8 months after their second child, 8 months before the birth of the second child. So pretty much as soon as they knew she was pregnant with the second child, okay, good, we have what we want here, and went out. So now that's a strange story, and it seems to have very much been an exception, okay, to the general pattern. But the key point I want to make here is that if Brigham Young was going to suggest this, here is a perfect opportunity to say, let's do this polyandry thing just like Joseph did back in Nauvoo. But he doesn't. The second marriage wasn't a sealing. There was this divorce. There was never this issue of one woman living with 2 men. And then they do a second sealing. So other things that's important, the Utah period did recognize eternity-only sealings, so it's certainly plausible that they did in Nauvoo, and we now know that at least one they did. We saw that early. Again, the absence of children. We've talked about that. But, if this is all about sex, where are the children? Joseph and Emma had, I think, 7 or 9. I don't remember offhand. But they had a number of children, not all of whom survived. But Joseph was certainly capable of conceiving, of fathering children. And yet, with all these opportunities, he didn't. And one other thing is that some church leaders didn't think they were consummated. They had the same opinion that I came to, though I didn't know that till after I'd come to it. And so they didn't feel much need to justify these because they didn't see them as sexual relationships, and so there was no scandalous aspect, if you like. John A. Widtsoe is one. And then this one, I love this one too. So the Temple Lot case. This is one of the stranger episodes in LDS history. So you remember that they were going to build a temple in Independence, Missouri, and then they got driven out of Independence, but they still there was a plot of land where they were going to do that. Well, the RLDS Church, the reorganized church, who were a break-off group after Joseph's death, they stayed in Missouri. They didn't migrate further and didn't go west to Utah. So they stayed in the area. And a break-off group from them, or a small other break-off group called the Temple Lot Church, claimed the temple lot. So that was kind of their thing. It's like, we got the lot where the temple's going to be, so you have to deal with us. And the RLDS wanted to claim that, no, it's our land, not the Temple Lot Church. What it came down to was who was the proper heir of Joseph Smith's legacy. So the Temple Lot was very anxious to prove that Joseph had practiced plural marriage, because the RLDS Church insisted that he never had. They were adamant about that Joseph had never practiced plural marriage, that it was an idea that the evil Brigham Young came up with. So if the Temple Lot could prove that Joseph had plural wives and he lived with them, if he cohabitated with them, had sex with them, that would prove to the courts that the RLDS Church was not the direct inheritors of Joseph, and so they had no right to the lot. So the RLDS want to prove that Joseph didn't have sexual relations. The Temple Lot desperately does. Okay. Were any of the living wives that were available polyandrous? Yes, 3 of them were. So they called other wives who were single when they married Joseph, and they testified to the sexual nature of their relationship. But they didn't call any of these 3 women. Who did they have? Zina Huntington, she was the General Relief Society president in good health and lived only a couple blocks away from where they were doing the case. They could have easily called her. Mary Elizabeth Rollins was well known. She lived only 38 miles away, and she was very happy to talk about plural marriage, and much of what we know about some things we only know from her, and she gave multiple talks about it that we have. So she would have been very willing to testify. There's one more, Patty Batlis Sarson, she lived 10 miles away. She was also 97, so maybe you want to give her a pass. But where are these women? Why aren't they called? There's lots of others here that were. Melissa Lott, Elizabeth Parshett, Lucy Walker. So again, it was useful. If they couldn't testify to sexual relations, then they were useless for their court case. It's also worth remembering, too, that polyandry would have been the hardest form of plural marriage. Plural marriage was always difficult for everybody involved. But polyandry would be even harder for a few reasons. One, there's no biblical precedent. There's plenty of Old Testament examples of men with multiple wives. There are no Old Testament examples of women with multiple husbands. The second thing is you have a wife with divided loyalties. And so if you're trying to, you could argue, well, Joseph was a man and after sex. Okay, fine. But the women, if you're going to seduce someone, it's easier to seduce someone who's single, not someone who has another husband with whom they have children and to whom they feel loyal and for whom they have religious bonds. So if you're trying to be clever and seduce people, polyandry is a very bad way to go about it. You also have the second husband in the picture, let's not forget, many of whom weren't church members. Not probably the smartest move if you're trying to keep this all on the down low. And yet these, as you saw in that first graph, were almost all the first plural marriages that Joseph did. Why did he do the hardest ones, or what we would call the hardest, first? And then why did these marriages mostly stop after that reported third angel visit, where the angel told Joseph, look, get with the program or you're done? So again, here, look, here's that angel visit, the second visit that I'm wondering about. And here are all these polyandrous marriages. So what I'm suggesting to you is there were 3 angel visits. The first was early on, which led to one sealing, and that was a terrible experience for everybody, and Joseph didn't do anything about it for years later. Then he got a second visit that may be over here somewhere, which led him to do one plural marriage, and then he kind of went crazy with these polyandrous marriages. My theory is that Joseph didn't really want to do this. He knew it would be hurtful to Emma, and so he was looking for a way to obey the commandment that wouldn't be as hurtful. And so these sealings for eternity, for sealing purposes but not cohabitation purposes, would have seemed easier. However, the third angel shows up here and says, nice try, Joseph, get with the program. And he does, to his credit. And then you see all that down here and here. So just a theory, but it does kind of explain a lot of things. Otherwise, it's very hard for me to understand why Joseph would pick these most difficult, most dangerous, most risky marriages, if you like, and do them first, and then completely abandon the idea, almost, a few exceptions. So if my theory is true, if what I've showed you here is true, then polyandry, this married to 2 women, has probably bothered more people in my experience than anything else. It turns out, ironically, it's probably the least difficult part for us to get our heads around or to accept. And it also demonstrates, I hope, that Joseph wasn't just someone who was callous about this. He wasn't insensitive to Emma's feelings, as he's somehow been portrayed. And he seems to have wanted to fulfill the commandment and spare her this, a very natural reaction. Whatever you decide about everything I've shown you, though, you should remember this. This is Catherine Danes. She's a BYU professor who wrote a book, one of the best books on plural marriage in the Utah period. She said this: perhaps nothing is less understood than Joseph Smith's sealing to women already married, because the evidence supports conflicting interpretations. That's as true now as when she wrote it, but if anything, the evidence has probably shifted to a non-sexual paradigm rather than a sexual one. And remember, anything before 2016, anything that anybody quotes you, anything that you read, if it was written before 2016, it doesn't have all the evidence. But that hasn't stopped critics from continuing to act as if the evidence was like it was 20 years ago when I first became interested in this topic. So, a lot of hay we've mown. Let's bail a bit to close. What lessons might we learn from that? Well, hopefully you've learned that history is complex. It takes time to answer a question. It is always, always easier to ask a question than answer it. And that's one tactic that critics of the church and anti-Mormons love, is it's to throw a whole bunch of questions at you. We saw that, I think, with our CES letter fireside, and then hope that you get buried and can't answer it. So you can ask me the question, was Joseph Smith married to multiple women who were also married, and what does that mean? There, in 10 seconds you've asked the question. It's taken me, almost an hour to give you the sketch of an answer. And if you were trying to find all this material yourself, it would take, of course, far, far longer. You'd have to read a lot more. I'm kind of giving you the highlights here. So remember that. If you want to answer a historical question, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work if you're going to do it right. Anybody can give cheap, canned answers, but if you want to be accurate, that takes work. The second thing I hope you learn is that evidence changes. 14 years ago, we were virtually certain, I would have bet money that Josephine was Joseph's daughter. I'd put money on it. And that she was conceived while her mother was married to her other husband. It turns out one of those things is definitely false, and the other one may be false. So the conclusion is, when you have doubts, when you have worries, when you have things about church history or the gospel that worry you, patience is a virtue. And that's often the thing people have the most trouble summoning up, because they're worried and they're frightened and they're angry and they're scared, and they want it fixed now. They want to go back to how it was, or they want to get it all resolved and feel good about it. And that's just not how the world works. If you have a serious, genuine, legitimate question, you have to put in serious, genuine, legitimate work. There's just no way around it. So be patient. The second thing is your patience is often rewarded. As I said, I started studying this stuff probably 20. And, if I had stopped, or if I had said, okay, that's it, I'm going to make my decision about the church based on that, I would have been wrong. There would have been lots of really important information that I just didn't have access to. And it was only because I waited and I paid attention that I found it. The other thing is that the critics will not necessarily stay up to date. In fact, they virtually always won't. And they don't tend to adjust their negative spin even when the evidence changes, because their goal is not to give you an accurate and full account of the history. It's not to understand the difficult and wrenching choices that early members of the church had to make. Their goal is to make you feel bad about the church, leave it, and adopt their way of looking at the world. And the last thing I hope you learn is that the more you learn, the more you study this stuff, the more evidence you get, the better Joseph and the saints look. I was content with how it was 15 or 20 years ago. I'm much more content now. Joseph looks even better than he did. So I said I began studying this 20 years ago. I remember the first time I really began thinking about this. I had a book. I'll have to show you the book sometime, maybe. Just if it's a really good example of how. Sorry, they think I'm on call. It's a really good example of how an author can mislead you. But anyway, I was reading this book, and I got to page 6 and page 7. And on page 6 and page 7, they dumped an enormous amount of stuff about plural marriage. And I read page 6 and page 7, and then I closed the book because I thought, okay, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if there is a good answer. And so there were 3 things I knew. One was I knew that I needed to, that this was the sort of thing that could threaten my testimony. That was the first thing I knew. The second thing that I knew was that if there was an answer, it would take a long time to find it. I knew that I was opening myself into, I knew enough about history to know I'm not just going to flip open a book and find this and be done. I'm going to have to put in some serious work if I expect to understand this. And the third thing that I knew is that I might not be good enough to find an answer or like the answer when I found it. The fourth thing I knew is that my testimony could not wait for those months that it took. As it turned out, it took me 6 months of reading and writing and thinking and stuff. But at that point, I thought, you know what? I can't put my spiritual life on hold. I can't just say, well, I'm not going to church until I figure this out. I don't recommend that course to you. But I need to do something. So I did what I hope most LDS people would do, is I thought, well, I should go pray about this. That's how we're taught. That's how we get answers to things. So when I knelt down to pray right after that, I had every intention of kind of demanding to God and saying, look, you've got to make this okay. You have to tell me the answer. That's what I intended to say when I knelt down. When I did kneel down, though, I found myself saying something quite different. If you read in the scriptures, it talks about how the Spirit will give you what to pray for. And this is one of the few experiences in my life where I'm certain that happened, because this was not at all what I was going to say or do when I knelt down. What I found myself saying to my Heavenly Father was that I had found something that troubled me, but that I would be loyal to Him and our relationship. I told him that I had made covenants and that I would keep them regardless of what he chose or didn't choose to tell me. And I told him that I had found something that I would really like an answer or an understanding to, but that even if I never got one, I would be true to what he and I had shared together. Kind of a different conversation. And as I did that, I had the peace and the love and the calm settle over me. And right then I knew it doesn't matter here. And I also knew that anything that I found, I didn't need to be afraid of. And that was incredibly liberating, because then I wasn't going and looking for stuff to justify Joseph or to make myself feel better. I could just say, hey, whatever it is, it's okay. So that's the thing I hope you take away most of all, is that all this history stuff, yeah, it's interesting, it's important, there are good answers out there, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to what's your relationship, and do you want that relationship? If you want it and you want it to grow, then I can help you, other people can help you, or you may not need my help. If you don't want it, if it's not important to you, if you're not already keeping your covenants, if you're not willing to grow and be stretched, then I'm sorry, there's not much we can do for you. But that shouldn't be surprising. That's how it always is in the gospel. This just kind of brings that into relief. I know that Joseph was a prophet of God, and that he was a good and honorable man who that. I know the church that he organized is true, and I know most of all that our Heavenly Father loves us and is there for us in difficult times. And that being faithful to that relationship is the most important thing. We talk about the faithfulness of God, or the faith of Jesus Christ. They were faithful to us. They do not abandon us. And so we must not abandon them at the first sign of trouble. I leave you that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.